Hello, welcome to Connecticut Capital Connection. I'm State Senator Gary Holder-Winfield, and I'm the State Senator for New Haven and West Haven. And with me today is Anna Maria Rivera Forastieri. I think I got that right. And she's with Rivera and Junta. And we're going to talk about a couple of items, beginning with an item that the Senate is looking to deal with, which is tipped workers and the wage that they get and how we deal with this wage. It's in Senate Bill 60. And it deals with the gratuity. So welcome to the program, Anna.
Thank you, Senator Holder-Winfield.
Yeah, I mess it up sometimes, so it's fine. So tell me a little bit about the issue and about why it's important to you and the organizations you're working with.
Sure. So the issue of tip workers, I think, is an issue that is pretty controversial, not only in Connecticut, but I think all over the United States. And last year, when the Connecticut legislature passed the minimum wage bill, at almost the very last minute, an amendment was introduced to exclude tip workers from receiving a raise. Tip workers already receive less than the minimum wage. They only receive a percentage called the tip wage. And so in Connecticut, up until last session, they received 69% of the full minimum wage. But at the urging of the Restaurant Association, that wage was reduced to 63.2%. So what that means is that the employer doesn't have to pay the full minimum wage. They credit the tips that customers leave for employees towards the minimum wage. And so it creates this system where workers are really relying on the good graces of customers for their core wage.
Right. So my understanding, though, just to be clear for the audience, is that if a worker is working and they don't receive tips, the employer is supposed to make that up.
Right. By law, they're supposed to make up the difference if they don't receive the full minimum wage. But both anecdotally and looking at data, the reality is that a lot of the times employers don't make up the difference, and so that puts workers in a really vulnerable position. Mm-hmm. It's difficult to track. It depends on the shift. It depends on which day they're working in, and so it makes things very difficult. And with the lack of resources that the Department of Labor has, it's very difficult to enforce.
And it would be on the worker to actually call this out, right?
Exactly. It would have to be the worker to call on the Department of Labor to create some type of investigation, and that takes time. Yeah. And
if you're a vulnerable worker, you probably wouldn't want to do that. Right?
Exactly. So a lot of the workers that we've spoken to tell us, it happens, but I need this job. I'm not going to complain. And also some of the workers that might not have permission to work because they don't have a work permit, for example, they just won't do it because they're afraid that they're going to get retaliated against.
What is your organization's position on the bill that's before the Senate?
Well, we fully support Senate Bill 60. Senate Bill 60 would increase the tip wage to 70% of the full minimum wage. Obviously, in an ideal world, we would get rid of the tip credit altogether, and there are 7 states in the nation that don't have a tip credit system at all, and their restaurant industries are actually thriving, and the job growth is actually pretty good. So we believe that 70% would be a fair compromise.
Okay. I tend to be someone who thinks that we should pay people the minimum wage. I recognize that Restaurant Association and others have made the argument that it's unsustainable, and as you said, there are other states where currently they're running where they pay the minimum wage. Are there other things that people should know about the issue?
What other things? I think that, the tip system is sometimes used by other industries to undermine the minimum wage. So Connecticut is lucky enough to actually be pretty progressive in this issue, and so very few workers are recognized as tip workers. In other states, for example, delivery drivers and car washers and people that do your nails at a salon are considered tip workers. And so I think that this tip system really undermines the full minimum wage. And we've seen that because, for example, the delivery industry in Connecticut just asked the Department of Labor to recognize their drivers as tip workers just recently, a couple of months ago. And so we see this trend where employers are trying to undermine the minimum wage and trying to cut, how much they're paying their employees by using this system.
So now when you say the delivery industry, you mean those people who deliver things to our front door?
Yes, mostly people that deliver food to your front door.
Okay. And I would assume that some of them are like some of the people who deliver some of the stuff I order to my front door. They knock and go.
Exactly.
So it doesn't make a lot of sense that we would include them as tipped workers. They probably don't actually have all that much interaction with the customers. So
Exactly.
yeah, there's another part of the bill dealing with credit cards and the way that credit cards play into the whole discussion about tipped workers. Can you speak a little bit about that?
Sure. So in speaking to some of the workers, we found out as well that not only do tip workers generally have to tip out, for example, they call tip out receiving their tips and having to give certain percentages to other employees within the same restaurant, but also the credit card fees that the employer has to pay the credit card company every time that they pass a credit card. A percentage, and in some instances, the full amount of that fee is taken out of the tips that are supposed to be going to the worker. So, for example, if the credit card fee is $2 and you went to a diner and had a small meal and left $2.50, the employer might take the full $2 and only give the worker 50 cents. So the bill actually, what it would do is it says that if the employer takes any type of percentage out of the tips of the worker to pay that fee, they can't claim the tip credit at all.
Okay. And I think that's a good thing to know, because I think most people who go to a restaurant who use a credit card, and most of us use a credit card or a debit card at least these days, one, don't even think about the fact that there's a fee, and certainly don't recognize that when they leave that tip, some portion of that tip is not going to the worker because it's going to pay for the fee that they don't recognize is there. So that's news to, I think, most people, and important when we think about the debate around the tipped workers. So
I totally agree. I think when I learned about it, I said, oh my God, so we're not only subsidizing the employer in terms of how he's paying the employee, but we're also subsidizing their fees that they have to pay their credit card company.
Right.
So I just think it's a very, unfortunate situation for workers.
Yeah, I think it's a vulnerable population, and many of us don't know very much about. We think that when we leave a tip, we're doing really good by them. But many of us think we're leaving that tip on top of whatever they make an hour, and we assume it's at least the minimum wage.
Right.
So I think this is a very important issue. I'm very happy to have you here to discuss it. And anything else before we go to the second segment?
No, I think, I hope that people recognize that this is a really vulnerable population, that these are adults with responsibilities. 2/3 of the workforce are actually women. So it's not only about helping these workers, but it's also about pay equity, because when you think about it, if a workforce is comprised of mostly women, and then you're not paying those women the full minimum wage, then you're undermining pay equity.
Well, thank you for joining me for the first segment. You're back for the second part. We'll be back very shortly. Welcome back. So, one of the bills that we worked on just recently in a recent past session was a bill dealing with what does Connecticut's response to immigration look like. And we know that immigration reform is a huge issue in the country. We also know that many people thought that last year the Congress of the United States was going to deal with it, but they didn't. And so we passed a bill to deal with what are called ICE detainers. And you know something about what's happened since that bill was passed. So let's talk about it and find out if we're where we need to be. So could you give us an update?
Sure. So I thank you so much for working on that excellent bill. Actually, Connecticut was the first state to pass a statewide bill like the Trust Act, and so I thought it was a huge victory for us. And you're right. We thought that immigration reform would have passed by now, and we know that it hasn't. And unfortunately, deportations have continued to happen every day. So 1,100 people are deported from this country every single day. And so, I think that the movement has shifted to not only work on immigration reform, but to also work on deportations. And so in looking at the effects of the Trust Act in Connecticut, we found that one of the exceptions that was included in the Trust Act, unfortunately, which was the prior order of removals, has really resulted in a lot of people still being held up in the system. And so there's very few instances in which someone is caught and they're held because they have some type of criminal conviction. What we're seeing is that most people just have an order of removal.
You briefly mentioned prior order removal. Can you kind of break that down so that people listening who may not really be familiar with the issue understand why this is an issue?
Right. So a prior order of removal can happen on many instances. It can either be ordered by a judge, it can be ordered by an ICE official, it can be ordered when you're trying to cross the border. And so there's a lot of instances in which someone can get a prior order of removal. So you don't even have to see a judge for someone to order you removed. You might not even be in court when you're ordered removed. And so just a lot of people, when they're crossing the border, might get stopped and might, go to some other states and might not show up for their court date. And so it's not really about being violent. It's about your presence in the United States. Mm-hmm. And so a lot of people end up having some type of order of removal in their in the system, and they end up getting caught.
So I'm assuming that as an advocate for the original bill, you would want this fixed. What does that fix look like?
Well, in an ideal world, we would get rid of secure communities altogether, and I think some of the advocates are pushing the president to do something like that because he does have the authority to do that. Secure communities, as you know, was intended to catch bad criminals and deport them, but we know from the data, even data that immigration has, that people that are being held and that are being deported are not criminals, and in fact, most of them maybe had some type of traffic violation or something like that. And it also leads to racial profiling. People that might not necessarily have been taken to a jail for a traffic violation might now be taken to a jail because they look, a little bit browner. Right. So in an ideal world, we would get rid of it altogether. But I think that at least the prior removal situation is very important to us, just because of the cases that we're seeing. The majority of people in Connecticut that we are seeing that are being held are being held for that reason.
Yeah. I think it's important that you brought up secure communities, because one of the things that I was arguing when we did the bill was about what the concept of secure communities really is. You could have the concept as foisted upon us by the federal government, but you could also have just a general sense that your community is secure. But communities made up of the types of people who might be affected by this bill aren't necessarily secure, because they might not be able to have a relationship with police or government officials that some of us get to enjoy, and therefore don't have what I would consider a secure community. And I think that was important to moving along this bill.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think another issue that we're seeing and that we also want to address is that Connecticut has different branches like everyone else. And the Department of Corrections is under the executive branch. And then we have the judicial marshals under the judicial branch. And the judicial marshals are a whole different law enforcement, agency. And I think that one of the issues that we're having is that they might have adopted a policy that somehow found a loophole within the Trust Act to not follow it. So we want to take a look at that as well and make sure that whatever we passed last year, at the very least, is being honored by all law enforcement. It doesn't matter which branch of government. Right.
So I think you're suggesting we have more work to do.
We do have more work to do.
Yeah, I think secure communities is particularly important, not just in each individual state, but I think the more that you do bills like the Trust Act, the more that you force the federal government to have to think about what its response is. Because if the state doesn't have a response to the federal government, which says, we aren't taking on your responsibility, we're not shouldering the cost of your poor immigration policy, the federal government really has to do something. And so that's why it was particularly important to me. I'm not the typical person you think of dealing with this issue, but I think the movement should be to do as many of these in as many states as possible, because then it becomes very difficult for the federal government to rely on the states to do its own work.
Right, yeah. I agree. And I think it's one of the things that a lot of people are not maybe aware of, is that a lot of these federal programs that they've come up with really burden the state. It costs the state a lot of money to run these programs here. And so, if you want to look at it at least at the cost effectiveness of it, you're seeing that it's costing states a lot of money when it really should be the federal government footing the bill.
Yep. Cost the state, bad public policy, communities aren't secure, is bad overall. We need to fix the Trust Act. So we're running low on time. Is there anything you want the audience to know about any of the organizations you work with, anything coming up? Here's your opportunity.
Sure. So like I mentioned, I'm one of the coordinators for the Connecticut Immigrant Rights Alliance, and they can actually find us on Facebook. We're pretty active. We do actions rallies. We work with legislators like yourself to improve the working and the living conditions of the immigrant population in Connecticut, and also through CIRA and through Junta for Progressive Action. If they're interested in working with us on some of the other topics that we talked about, like the tip worker campaign, they can go to our website, juntainc.org, or they can email me at Anamaria, ANAMARIA .Rivera, RIVERA, at juntainc.org. That's
a mouthful. Thank you for joining me. Thank you for talking about some important issues about the Trust Act and about tipped workers. I'm State Senator Gary Holder-Winfield. Thank you for joining us too.